Shown as a faithful mother devoted to the care of the home and committed to the transcendental task of shaping future German generations, her last years were not exempt from public and private turbulence, affairs, disappointments, and a fatal end. With the famous Goebbels couple taking their own lives, the faithful mother, the story of the First Lady of German National Socialism. Johanna Maria Magdalena Richel was born in Berlin on November 11, 1901. Her father was Oskar Richel, a prominent engineer who worked as a construction contractor. Her mother was Auguste Baron, a woman of just 20 years old who dedicated herself to keeping the home. The parents were not married when Magda was conceived, and even though they got married later, they didn't stay together for long. So Magda Goebbels would grow up in a home torn apart by her parents' divorce. Later, her mother would have a second marriage with Jewish magnate Richard Friedlander, a successful businessman. Both her biological father and her Jewish stepfather would be present in her life as paternal figures. During these years, the brother nations had only been unified as the German nation-state for a few decades, and they were considered one of the most vigorous regions at an economic, artistic, and cultural level, not only in Europe, but in the world. Since neither of her parents had time to devote to her education, they decided to enroll Magda in the Ursuline convent, known at that time as one of the strictest female boarding schools in Europe. It was in this rigorous learning environment and deep religious devotion where Magda would form her tough discipline, which would be a large part of her life. During her stay at the convent, Magda became a popular girl among her peers. With her premature wit, she caused no problems for those in charge of her education. She participated in the spiritual exercises with devotion and professed a fervent faith while she was there. When she left the boarding school at 8 years old, she was remembered as an active and intelligent girl. In August of 1914, following the outbreak of the First World War, her family leaves Belgium to return to Germany. During these years, her family was forced to change their lifestyle due to the pressing economic situation caused by the war. These material shortages would plunge the young Magda into an early depression. Although her life in the boarding school had been humble and simple, Magda was unaccustomed to worries. Until then, she had grown up surrounded by luxury, and due to her father's good position, she took for granted the luxury that surrounded her. During the 4 years of the war, Magda attends night classes at Kolmorgen High School. It is at this stage of her youth where she would come into contact with Buddhism for the first time. Her biological father, despite having been a devout Catholic, begins to be attracted to the Eastern religion and ignites the same interest in his daughter Magda. In his spare time, he gave Magda books about Buddhism and discussed them with her. And so, little by little, her father turns her into a fervent disciple of Buddha's teachings, displacing Catholicism from her spiritual life. From this moment on, Buddhist literature would always accompany her by her bedside, and she would maintain the belief in a terrestrial rebirth, but purified after death for the rest of her existence. However, Buddhism would be an aspect of her life that she would only share with her closest social circle. Would these Eastern spiritual beliefs play a role in the fatal outcome that the family would later have? After years of battle in World War I, Germany is humiliated after the defeat in the war. Internal revolutions also resulted in the abdication of the German Kaiser and the end of the monarchy in that region. And the Treaty of Versailles imposes very unfavorable economic and military conditions for the former German regional power. The period that was later called the Weimar Republic began. At 17 years old, Magda was already a girl who stood out not only for her physical attractiveness, but also for her level of culture. In general knowledge, she surpassed all her peers and demonstrated a level of maturity also superior for her age. Her main friends were girls older than her and even teachers. She preferred to spend time with them rather than share her free time with women her age and her year. At home, she was the only child, moreover, and she had never had friends her own age. And both her stepfather and her biological father had treated her as an equal since childhood. However, Magda would make the definitive leap into adulthood at the least expected moment. In 1920, during a train journey, the young Magda, barely 18 years old, would accidentally meet her first husband, the businessman Gunther Quandt, a German magnate without much elegance or physical attractiveness. 20 years older than her. Soon they start dating and Quandt proposes to her. And without much thought, Magda accepts the proposal, becoming the young wife of one of the richest men in Germany. And in addition, she becomes the stepmother of the 2 children that this businessman had from a previous marriage. The news was received with astonishment by Magda's circle. Everyone took for granted that Magda was fortunate to have settled the rest of her life, accepting marriage to the leader of a large, powerful industrial empire. However, shortly after, Magda's new husband begins to impose conditions to safeguard his heritage and prestige. Quandt demands that she convert to Protestantism and reassume her biological father's surname, to which Magda had no objection. At first, what seemed like a happy marriage, with both parties satisfied, begins to wither as problems start to arise between them. Magda, who had a special sensitivity for art, disliked how her new husband did not appreciate beauty or history. He was a successful businessman, focused on expanding his economic power and therefore lacked enough time to share with Magda. Although the relationship between them was distant, they managed to conceive a child. Only that Magda had to take care not only of her new child, but also of her 2 stepchildren and 3 more children who had been adopted by her husband, upon learning that his friend had passed away, leaving his children orphaned. And she had to bear this gigantic responsibility, plus the care of the house. Meanwhile, her husband lived in a world far apart, paying no attention to the problems that Magda was having. Despite the opulent lifestyle that her husband's businessman status allowed her to enjoy, Magda was unhappy with the marriage and secretly wished to divorce. And then, after 9 long years of a cold relationship with Quandt, Magda meets a young man at a party with whom she would have a fleeting romance. With him, Magda would start to enjoy all those romantic gestures that she did not receive from her husband. She would even travel with her lover, staying in the most expensive hotels, without worrying too much about hiding the love affair she was having behind her husband's back. However, noticing Magda's change in attitude, her husband hires a private detective who quickly discovers his wife's affair. In retaliation, Magda is forever expelled from her husband's house and is forced to pack her entire life into a few suitcases. Despite the distress her husband is going through, Magda manages to sign a generous divorce settlement in financial terms, and she promises that she would never marry again in her life. Parallel to all this, in Germany, the Weimar Republic was going through a tough period of economic crisis, unemployment, and moral decay. Meanwhile, more and more Germans were suspicious as many members of the Jewish religion held quite a few positions in leadership roles in this crisis-ridden Germany. Amidst this, a party that promoted the ethnic and national unity of the Germans and the return of the old German greatness was gaining popularity among the people. Returning to Magda, her promise to never have a stable love again would last just a few months into 1930. Although she had never been interested in politics, Magda attends a meeting of the National Socialist Party. There, she listens to the speech of a persuasive speaker that keeps her mesmerized in her seat. She was fascinated by such a display of eloquence and leaves so convinced of the party's ideals that days later she joins as a militant. The man who awakens in Magda this deep interest in German politics. He was a short, thin man with a broad culture and knowledge in history, philosophy, and art, and with a great wit for politics and speech, which allowed him to quickly rise through the ranks of the National Socialist Party. His name was Joseph Goebbels when the party director visits him to welcome him to the group. He offers Magda the position of leader of the National Socialist Women's Organization in a small town in the country. Without any objection or asking what her job would entail, Magda accepts the offer. She had found a new interest and a new passion. To better understand the party's ideology, she buys a copy of the book Mein Kampf and reads it from beginning to end. Likewise, she starts following in the press all the speeches given by the main leaders of the party. And eager to get more seriously involved in the growth of the movement, she resigns from her secondary position and goes to one of the most important party headquarters in Berlin in search of greater responsibility. Magda is hired as a secretary for a National Socialist politician, but soon after, while she was going down some stairs at the offices, she crosses paths with Joseph Goebbels, dressed in a trench coat, who lays his eyes on her, attracted by her physical charm. This great speaker, who had hypnotized Magda some time ago, quickly approaches the reception to ask who that woman was that he had crossed paths with. After discovering her identity, he demands to meet her. When she finally sits down to talk with Goebbels, Magda assures him that the speech he had given some time ago was what had motivated her to join the party. And Goebbels, fascinated by her beauty but also by her cultural level, he offers Magda to work as his secretary, to which she accepts without hesitation. From then on, Magda would have in her hands the private files of her future husband, and she would handle information about everything that happened within the party, as well as what was being said about it internationally. Over time, their working relationship evolved into a closer, more personal one. Goebbels begins to invite Magda to private party meetings, attends social gatherings with her at friends' houses, and discusses philosophy with her for long hours. The degree of trust he felt for her even led him to invite her to his own home. Magda had found the place where she felt happy. Surrounded by all those personalities, she felt that she was recognized for her intellectual abilities and not just for her physical beauty. But in addition to feeling fulfilled, her attraction to Joseph Goebbels was growing rapidly. Every day, she sat up late into the night in front of Goebbels. Week after week, they worked more and more closely, and soon Goebbels made no major decision without first consulting with his secretary, Magda. His secretary was no longer just his secretary, but a faithful confidant for whom he also felt romantic attraction. Finally, in 1931, Joseph and Magda begin to be together in a romantic relationship, with plans to marry by the end of the year. However, an obstacle that crossed Magda's life almost prevented the marriage from taking place. Magda maintained a friendship with the same lover with whom she had betrayed her first husband. He, however, was still secretly in love with Magda and held out hope of someday marrying her. Upon learning from Magda herself that she was going to marry Joseph Goebbels, the man pulls out a revolver, points it at Magda, and shoots her in a fit of jealousy. The bullet hits near her, giving her time to escape and call the police. This altercation would only serve to deepen Magda's love for Goebbels and her commitment to the party. After the upset, Joseph and Magda, with Adolf as godfather, would get married in December of 1931. This despite the almost unanimous disapproval of Magda's entire circle. During their first years of marriage, Magda would dedicate herself to the household chores. As her position within the party continued to grow, she collaborated with and witnessed the growing popularity of the Nazi Party, where her husband was a key figure. Meanwhile, in Germany, the economic and political situation was growing more chaotic. The population was looking for an alternative to bring order to the country. As a result, the National Socialist Party achieved a meteoric rise and won hundreds of seats in the German parliament. Finally, by 1933, following an agreement between the political establishment and the economic power, the coalition of deputies of the National Socialist Party and the faction of deputies of the Conservative Party, they appoint the leader of the National Socialist Party as the new Chancellor of Germany. A new era for the country would open. This momentous event would bring multiple changes to Magda's life. Her husband was no longer just a speaker known for his eloquence or a political agitator. Joseph Goebbels was now a state authority and would go on to hold the position of Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And Magda had to also assume the consequences of such responsibility. Magda Goebbels and her husband were passionate, convinced, and proud of the National Socialist cause. Magda was always committed to the party's ideals and also enjoyed a good friendship with Adolf. So she would become one of the most important female faces in the entire government. Magda jumps into the limelight as the public image of the Women's League of the National Socialist Party, an organization that was responsible for promoting the party's ideological vision of women among the population. And in this propagandistic work of the League, it reaches millions of German women who were called to live according to the worldview of the Third Reich, being patriotic women, with the great mission of raising future generations of strong and healthy German men, and to maintain the best possible home for the men who would be on the street building the new German Empire. As the head of the National Socialist government, he had decided to present himself to the public as a single man. Magda begins to be considered, with her constant exposure in the media, as a kind of first lady of the Third Reich, even though she was the wife of a government minister and not the chancellor. But this was a position that was not limited to propaganda. Being considered as the First Lady did have a real effect on her life. Magda acted as an unofficial representative of the regime and received letters from women all over the country, with questions about domestic issues, child custody matters, and other various issues. When was it necessary to optimize National Socialist propaganda around these values? The entire Goebbels family was taken by the propaganda machinery as the example of the Aryan family, which the rest of the families in Germany should follow. Both she and her role as a mother and her children were photographed and recorded on multiple occasions, transmitting a lifestyle associated with the ideal proposed by the family and the German government. However, in parallel, problems also began within the marriage of Magda and Joseph. Both, exhausted by the circumstances in which they lived, begin to secretly maintain extramarital relationships with lovers involved in the public scene. For example, Magda has two lovers. First, a romance with Kurt Lüdecke, a wealthy party sympathizer who contributed to its funding, and then, in 1938, with Karl Hanke, a high-ranking party official who had worked in the Ministry of Propaganda. And for his part, Joseph Goebbels had a relationship with Lida Baroba, a Czechoslovakian actress who lived in Berlin, a few blocks from Goebbels' house. This romance between the minister and the actress almost twisted the fate of both and even of the National Socialist government, as Goebbels, totally blinded by the passion of this new romance, proposes to abandon his post as minister, retire from politics, and leave his marriage with Magda to go as ambassador in Japan with his new lover, on the verge of the start, nothing more and nothing less than the Second World War. However, the Führer refuses to grant his wish and demands that he end his romance with the actress, to silence all the rumors that began to emerge about the family that propaganda painted as ideal. Both Joseph and Magda were photographed together again to show the public that the problems had ceased. But the truth is that from then on, the marriage was never the same. Behind closed doors, the first 6 years of the National Socialist government, Germany experiences a great economic rebound thanks to increased security and political stability, in conjunction with strong surveillance and political repression of the party's enemies. However, multiple factors that deserve another video end up triggering England and France to declare war on Germany, thus starting World War II. This new scenario would force Joseph Goebbels to redouble his propaganda efforts, while Magda, for her part, continues to appear to the public as the female leader within the party. And although the relationship of the marriage remains in a state of coldness, they remain united until the end of the war, following the Führer's guidelines not to tarnish the public image of the government. With a divorce in their inner circle, setting aside their differences, they leave marital fights to focus on Germany's advancement in the war. However, this does not prevent Goebbels from continuing to have affairs with other hidden women. After the outbreak of the war, Magda is forced to play a new role within the propaganda of the ministry headed by her husband. In times of peace, she had been the mother devoted to her maternal responsibility, but now in times of war, she was portrayed as a woman dedicated to the healthcare of the soldiers and as a strong mother who keeps the home in peace in the absence of the father who was fighting in the war. Likewise, she becomes a diligent hostess at private social events and gets involved in programs dedicated to helping war widows. The Europeans fought a war fiercely and bravely, and in the German spirit, a martyrdom mood grows. The mentality of embracing death before falling into enemy hands was common. Joseph Goebbels plays a crucial role in lifting the spirits of the population during this war period. In her private life, Magda remained friends with the Führer, whom she continued to greatly admire as she had from the start. However, with the first failures that Germany begins to suffer on the Eastern Front, Magda's opinion about Adolf begins to change. One day in 1942, she was at a gathering among friends. When a speech by Adolf starts playing on the radio, Magda turns off the radio and exclaims, "My God, what a load of rubbish." She also views Joseph Goebbels similarly. Magda confesses to a close friend of hers that she thought Goebbels was one of the biggest scoundrels she has ever known in German politics. Resigned to living an unhappy marriage with her husband, Magda had given up any hope of resurrecting the lost love between them. She no longer fought with her husband over his constant infidelities that everyone in Berlin knew about, but simply faced the situation with humor. Her hopes of reviving her marriage with Goebbels were buried, along with her hopes for Germany's victory in the war. After 2 years of victory after victory for Germany, the involvement of the Soviet Union and later the United States sealed the fate of the brothers. In the face of such a horrific situation for the German people, Goebbels was one of the few German leaders who continued to face the public head-on, and he managed to keep the morale of the population high. By 1944, unease had conquered Magda's spirit because she was convinced that Germany would suffer an absolute defeat sooner rather than later, and that meant not only a defeat for Germany but certain death, both for her and for her husband and their 6 children. To this gigantic disillusionment was added a severe depression and a chronic pain in the face, which plunged her heart even further into deep affliction. In these moments of tribulation, her esoteric and Buddhist beliefs were her only comfort. Magda continued to cultivate her faith in Buddhism, clinging to the idea of reincarnation, as her last hope to live again a life without so much pain and suffering. Magda's last months of life were a time of agonizing suffering. For many weeks she lived bedridden, listening from the radio. As the entire Third Reich system was falling apart with the new victories of the Allied side, thousands of Germans were dying on the battlefield, real impossibilities to avoid defeat. Meanwhile, the luckiest ones began to suffer the consequences of the shortage at home. Ironically, her only comfort during these days was the love of her husband, although it seemed impossible and she had lost all her hope just before the end. The love between Magda and Joseph Goebbels revives with the same strength it had at the beginning. Perhaps the proximity of death and defeat made them see what was truly important again. However, this regenerated infatuation between them would only last a few weeks. The Allied troops were quickly approaching Berlin, and the end of the Third Reich seemed soon to come. As the Germans found themselves cornered, Goebbels broadcast speeches on the radio, swearing that he would fight to the death, and that he and his family were prepared to die with dignity rather than face the humiliation of surrender. When the Red Army finally enters the capital, Goebbels' family moves to the Board Bunker, an underground shelter located beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery. There, Magda would live the last hours of her life with her family, but before making the final decision, she writes a farewell letter to one of her sons, who was in Africa as a prisoner of war. In it, she writes the following: the world that is coming. After the Führer and National Socialism, it's not worth living anymore. And therefore, I'm taking the children with me because they are too good for the life that would follow. And a merciful God will understand me when I give them salvation." End quote. One day before the Führer and his presumed wife ended their lives, the top German leader designates in his will Joseph Goebbels as his successor, but the Goebbels family would follow their leader to the grave. The next day, Magda prepares to end the lives of her children before taking her own life alongside her husband. The most widely shared version by historians about the event maintains that they ordered the present doctor to prepare 6 morphine injections to put the children to sleep. Having done this, Magda takes it upon herself to place a cyanide capsule in their mouths and press each of her children's heads and jaws until they broke. Once poisoned, Magda approaches Goebbels to do the same with him, firmly believing that she would reincarnate into a new life. Although there is no certainty about the way they died, the truth is that they managed to avoid the humiliation of the Third Reich's defeat. In this way, the life of the First Lady of the German Third Reich and the Goebbels family came to an end. With them, what little was left of the National Socialist project had also finished dying. Germany would be occupied by the Allies and its sovereignty lost. The Goebbels would not live to see the total surrender of the former glorious German army. Thank you for watching this video, and once again I invite you to follow us on our new channel, Mysteries of History, where we will be publishing unpublished, exclusive, and very interesting content on a large number of topics. Don't miss the opportunity to subscribe once and for all, and of course, also like this video, leave your comments, and follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia. Until next time, and God bless.